Hey everybody, this is Professor Barry, and I hope that you are doing well today. We are going to talk a little bit about the book of Exodus. So, this week we are in the Old Testament book of Exodus, and that's right after Genesis. And I hope that you've taken some time to look over your weekly PowerPoint. So, I just want to talk a little bit more about this very interesting book, the second book of the Pentateuch. Remember the first five books and the second book of the Old Testament. So, the whole thing with this particular word, the Exodus, that means going out. And so, you have to ask yourself, who's going out? Remember, the Old Testament is history of the Israelite people, Jewish culture, and these individuals or this group of historical people are moving from one place to the next, and they're moving out of the country of Egypt, and they're moving out of Egypt. So you see in the book of Genesis that we start to form this group with their patriarch named Abraham. Okay, and so I also want you to see many times when we read the Bible, there are a lot of similarities to us. And when you hear about the Exodus and slavery that the Israelites went through, wasn't necessarily the same, but there are some similarities that African Americans were able to draw, and strength that they were able to draw from the Israelite people because of the type of suffering that they went through at the hand of Pharaoh. All right, so I want you to also understand who possibly wrote the book of Exodus. There are some theories that Moses wrote it, and then there are some other theories that said that Moses could have dictated information to maybe a scribe or others that were working with him. Some other people think that perhaps Joshua could have written this. Now, I do believe that perhaps Moses wrote part of it, but I want you to read a little bit, and it seems like also you get the birth story of Moses in the beginning, and I want you to think about that. Now, many times we don't know a lot of the stories about our birth, and how could you write about your birth? So perhaps that was maybe given to Moses, or somebody else wrote that down. So there may been some things that Moses did write, and when you hear this particular word Mosaic, that means that Moses could have authored it. Mosaic. You Okay, let me go on a little bit more. So the purpose of the book of Exodus, remember in this particular book, Exodus means going out. A group of people are leaving one place and going to the next. The purpose of this particular book is, your main character is Moses. He's a leader of the Israelite or Hebrew people, and he's being called to lead this people out of bondage from Pharaoh. So you see, the big character is Moses, and all the people that will, his sister, and you'll see a lot of people that will come around to help Moses in this work. Another purpose of the book of Exodus is to show God as Yahweh, to show that the Israelite people are favored by God, and to show that God didn't leave them alone and has always been with them. Another purpose of this particular book, when we read from beginning to end, or even just try to do like a cursory glance of the book of Exodus, God always stays with the Israelite people. But another thing that's really interesting is that God always takes care of God's own, and takes care of the people that harm God's people. And the Egyptians, or the people that were working with Pharaoh, they become dealt with. Okay, so we can always see that God is a redeeming God, excuse me, to the Israelite people. In your PowerPoint, I give you a slide that has Yahweh written in the Hebrew language. And I want you to understand that in Jewish culture, they did not speak the name of God on their lips, or they did not write it, because they felt that this name was so sacred. So instead of saying or writing it all the way out, they would write, YHWH, instead of all of Yahweh. Yahweh. And they felt that this particular name had so much power in it that they did not want to abuse the name of God, and they were so careful that even when they wrote in their in these particular scripts that now became part of the Bible, they never wrote out the full name of God because it was just that special to them. In the book of Exodus, remember, we see the Israelite people moving out of Egypt, and if you look in your textbook, you'll see some routes that they could have taken. We don't know definitely which routes that they took, but they did move out together as a group from Egypt. Now, anybody moving as a group, it never works well. So there are always some stopping and some arguing along the way. And the people of Israel had a lot of cantankerous attitudes for Moses. Many of them wanted to go back and be in bondage in Egypt rather than experience the taste of freedom. Excuse me if you hear a train in the background. There were some plagues that God sent to get the attention of Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is the oppressor, or was the oppressor of the Israelite people. And I want you to go to page 114 and 115 in your book. There's a list of those plagues. And it was said that when God sent these plagues to the Egyptian people, it was it was in combat to the type of deities that they were worshiping. You have to remember in the Old Testament that at this particular time, monotheism, which is worshiping one God, was not always accepted by all groups of people. And in the Egyptian culture, they did worship many different deities. Okay, and so they worshiped different gods and they believed in different gods, and God, or Yahweh, was not very pleased with that. And so you will see that there are different plagues that will come against the Egyptian people to combat those individual gods that they said that they were oppressing. So as you go throughout the book of Exodus, it also lays the foundation for Jewish culture as we see things today. You still hear of Passover, right? And the Passover is still celebrated by those who follow the Jewish culture. And this was a time that they set aside to remember. Jewish heritage follows a lot of remembrance. I think sometimes, especially in the African American community, sometimes we forget where we came from, and we forget to reminisce and to look back and to pay homage to those who paved the way for us. But in Jewish culture, they make a point to pause every year and to remember the exiting or the departing out of their people from Egypt, and they will celebrate that during the Passover. So I want you to get a little bit of information about the Passover, and you'll see that information on your PowerPoint. And lastly, one of the big things in the book of Exodus that we still carry with us today in the Christian faith is the Ten Commandments. And so the Lord gives on tablets to the leader Moses these commandments, these rules. And I don't want you to think that they're just 10 rules or commandments that God had, but these are just 10 out of many different things that those who follow the Christian faith or even Hebrew faith should follow. There are many different things that we should follow, right? However, the 10 commandments were a list of things that God wanted to give to the Israelite people, to give order, to help them to think about how they should live. And I want you to go to the end of your PowerPoint, and I found something that was really interesting from my seminary days. These 10 commandments have a lot of history, and there are some principles from the Egyptian culture called Ma'at 42 principles of Ma'at. And I want you to just take a look at that video that I have for you at the end of your PowerPoint. And I just want you to compare and contrast some of those Egyptian principles to the Ten Commandments. Some of them are very similar. So the 42 principles of Ma'at actually existed before the Ten Commandments. So it's so much history out there for us to learn. All right, everybody, I know this was a lot. I pray that you are having a very blessed day and learning so much in the Old Testament. Take care.